Hi folks, and welcome to part 2 of my Eduard 148 Bf109 build. This is a Bf109E from the Barbarossa dual combo boxing. In the last video we managed to complete the entire build, and in this video we're going to be tackling the painting. So let's get stuck in. Before I put down any paint whatsoever, I had to mask the canopy. This was done with the immensely helpful Eduard pre-cut mask set that comes in the kit. The masks were peeled off of their paper backing and then put carefully into place. The next job was to spray the interior colour for the framework of the canopy. This was done with Mission Models RLM02, sprayed straight onto the plastic. I usually do this before filling any gaps around the canopy, as the interior canopy colour hides the colour of any putty you might use to fill the gaps. For this job, I'm using AK Grey Modelling Putty. This is a water-based putty that makes cleanup really easy. So before the putty is cured, you can use a wet Q-tip or a brush and wipe away any excess putty you don't want before it dries. Okay, let's get some primer on this 109. I'm using Mr. Surfacer 1500 Black, thinned 40% paint to 60% Mr. Leveling Thinner. This primer lays down really smooth and is also really durable. The downside is it's lacquer based, so it does stink a bit. When spraying down primers like this, it's always best to spray with wet coats. The best way to do this is to spray really close to the model, around 1 cm, and make sure each wet pass of the airbrush overlaps the previous one. This helps them blend together, giving you a smooth finish overall. But don't worry if your primer layer isn't as smooth as you'd like. You can just spray some Mr. Leveling Thinner over the surface. This is best done very carefully at around 8 psi, and you need to be careful not to add too much because you can wash the primer away. What this does though is reactivate the paint, so in essence it's self-leveling itself again. The wheel wells were painted with Mission Models RLM02. I tried to do this carefully so I wouldn't have to do any tidying later. I could have masked it and made it a bit easier, but I like living life on the edge. Getting in all the crevices in the wheel wells took a bit of airbrush gymnastics, but I got there in the end. For the main paintwork over the entire airframe, I'm going to be using Mission Models. I'll start with the undersides. For the underside colour, I'm using Mission Models RLM70. This time around though, I won't be using the Mission Models thinner. I'll be trying out the VMS Airbrush Thinners 2.0. This will be combined with the polyurethane mixative as normal. I started off by decanting 20 drops of RLM78 into a shot glass. This was followed by around 7 drops of polyurethane mixative and around 10 drops of VMS Airbrush Thinners 2.0. This is a bit thinner than the ratio Mission Models recommend, but we'll see how we get on. I'll be using the black basing technique for this aircraft to give myself more control over the shadows and highlights on the airframe. This process works by gradually increasing the opacity of the paint layers to give you a more solid colour. I usually layer the paint in between rows of rivets, in the centres of panels and on hatches. This is done with small, random, squiggly motions, and this introduces a level of randomness that you don't get with a solid colour, helping to make your finish look more believable and varied. The more layers you put down, the more opaque the paint becomes. And if you put less paint down, more of the black base colour is going to show through, giving you some artificial shading. Once you've done the first stage of your black basing, this is then followed by a thin, transparent layer of the base coat called a blend layer. This effectively tones down and blends the previous layers, making it look more subtle. The areas for the theatre markings on the wings were masked off with wide masking tape. This was then given a base layer of MRP white straight out of the bottle. This stuff goes down so smooth. When pre-shading yellow, if you use black underneath, it gives the yellow a green tinge. So it's ideal to use a dark yellow or a brown to stop this from happening. For this, I used MRP dark yellow, sprayed really close to the model, like a few mil, at around 8 psi. At the end of the day, the closer you are to the surface you're painting, the finer your lines are going to be. With the pre-shading complete, the yellow areas were given several light coats of MRP Insignia yellow. Now, yellow paint is usually notorious for having poor coverage. It also dries quite slowly, even in lacquer form, so it's imperative to be patient when you're putting this colour down. It's best built up in several light coats, making sure each previous layer is dry before committing to the next one. The demarcation lines between the upper and lower camouflage were masked, and any blue overspray was covered over with Mr. Surfacer 1500 black. Now, although this aircraft was used for the Battle of Barbarossa, it was shipped directly from North Africa, so it kept its tropical paint scheme whilst serving in the Eastern Front. The upper side colour, Mission Model's RLM79, was thinned with the same ratios as the underside colour. 20 drops of paint, 7 drops of poly, and around 10 drops of thinner. This was then sprayed in the same black basing manner as before. With the base colour camo complete, it was time to move on to the green camo splotches. For these green splotches, I used Mission Model's RAL 6003. It's not as dark a green as it should be, but I think it looks good. The splotches were painted by carefully drawing the outline with the airbrush and then backfilling the colour. This was done at around 10 to 12 psi. And as you can see, I'm working really close to the model to make sure I don't get any overspray. For work like this, you need to be really on the ball with your trigger discipline. Too little trigger and you won't get any paint. Too much trigger and you'll get a big splat, which nobody wants. Another tip to help avoid overspray is to spray towards the centre of the green area that you'll be painting. This helps minimise any overspray you'll see on the sand surface. I did have a bit of trouble with paint getting stuck in my airbrush. I think that because recently I've moved to a 0.15 nozzle and needle combination, whereas previously I had a 0.2, I think the Mission Models paint struggled at this pressure with this finer nozzle. The theatre band wrapped around the fuselage was painted in the same way as the underwing yellow sections. A base layer of MRP white, then a pre-shade of MRP dark yellow, and then several light coats of MRP Insignia yellow. With the paint on the main airframe complete, it was time to paint some of the smaller details before attaching them to the model. The spinner was sprayed with an off-white colour. This was then masked off and a layer of Mission Models RLM70 was painted over the rest. On reference photos, quite often you see ME109 propellers looking quite beat up, so I decided to replicate this with this build. Over the primer layer of Mr. Surfacer 1500 Black, I sprayed a layer of ALCLAD aluminium. This was then given 2 light coats of MIG chipping scratches effects. And then the final propeller colour, Mission Models RLM70 mixed with polyurethane mixative, was sprayed over this. When this was dry, the chipping fluid was reactivated with a brush wet slightly with water. I used this brush and an incidental brush to wear and chip away at the paint until some of the metal was visible. At the moment, this heavily chipped propeller doesn't match the pristine airframe, but don't worry, we'll address that in the next episode. The oleo piston on the landing gear leg was painted with Molotov chrome marker that was decanted into a palette and then thinned with 99% isopropyl alcohol. The resin wheels were then glued into place with VMS Extra Thin Flexi 5K CA. For the penultimate step in this video, I'm sealing in the 109 with a layer of VMS Satin Varnish HD. I did this with 2 light, wet coats sprayed at around 25 psi. And finally, I painted the exposed Canon and MG barrels with Mr. Metal Colour Dark Iron. This was then buffed to a light sheen, and this part of the build was complete. Before I get to the final gallery images, I'd like to say a huge thanks to my patrons. Your support is really appreciated and it helps keep the channel running. If you're interested in becoming a patron, click the link in the description, the card above, or head to patreon.com/LPJ Models. I'd also like to remind everyone that the LPJ Models Discord server is now live. It's a great place to make friends, talk models, and right now there's a group build running. The theme is Shelf of Doom and it's running until the end of August, so head over and get signed up. Just head down to the description and click the invite link. I also look forward to seeing you next week when the final video launches. This will cover the decals and the weathering on this Messerschmitt Bf109 by Eduard. Until then, I'm James from LPJ Models. Thanks for watching.